The Carnegie Institution of Washington occupies a quiet brick building on Broad Branch Road in the northwest of the city, set back from the street behind old trees. In the late autumn of 1941, the building's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism had a wing devoted to a project that almost no one outside it knew existed. The men working in that wing were physicists and electrical engineers, most of them in their 30s, almost all of them recruited personally by a 40-year-old South Dakotan named Merle Anthony Fuze. They were trying to do something that the most respected ordnance engineers in Europe had concluded could not be done. They were trying to build a working radio inside an artillery shell. The objection was not philosophical, it was mechanical. A 5-inch shell fired from a naval gun left the muzzle at roughly 2,800 feet per second. In the thousandth of a second it took to clear the rifling, the projectile experienced an acceleration on the order of 20,000 times the force of gravity. A miniature glass vacuum tube, the kind used in the small hearing aids that had begun to appear in the late 1930s, weighed about 3 grams. Ralph Baldwin, who later wrote the most thorough technical history of the project, would describe the loading on such a tube during firing in a vivid analogy. He compared it to a 140-pound woman standing on a single high heel, with the heel resting on the tube. The shell would also rotate as it left the barrel. Different sources cite different rates, somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 revolutions per minute as the projectile left the muzzle. The centrifugal forces at that spin rate would tear ordinary electronic components off any conventional circuit board. These were the conditions a working radio fuse would have to survive in order to begin operating, and it would then have to do its job within a few seconds, transmitting a continuous radio wave outward, listening for the reflection from a target, and detonating the shell when the reflection grew strong enough. German engineers at firms like Rheinmetall Borsig, who had been studying their own version of the problem since the late 1930s, had concluded by the autumn of 1940 that no such device could be made to function reliably with any electronics then in existence. The British had reached a similar conclusion about their own ability to produce one. The American Bureau of Ordnance, when the proposal first crossed its desk, had been skeptical for the same reasons. What the men in the building on Broad Branch Road were beginning to suspect, in November and December of 1941, was that the engineering objection might be technically correct and yet still beatable, because the objection assumed the components had to be the components that already existed. If you were prepared to build new components from scratch, with new materials and new manufacturing techniques, the calculation changed. They had not yet proved this. They were a long way from proving it, but they had begun to believe it was possible, and they had begun the slow, expensive, methodical work of finding out. 2 years and 2 months after that quiet autumn at the Carnegie Institution, on the morning of the 5th of January 1943, a Japanese Aichi D-3A dive bomber would be falling into the sea off the south coast of Guadalcanal, brought down by a 5-inch anti-aircraft shell that had detonated in mid-air without ever physically touching the aircraft. The shell had carried in its nose a working radio receiver and transmitter that German and British engineers, 3 years earlier, had separately concluded was a physical impossibility. This is the story of how that happened, and of why one of the most consequential engineering achievements of the war was for decades almost unknown outside the people who had built it. The popular memory of the Second World War has space for the atomic bomb and for radar. It has very little space for what scientists at the time, and historians since, have placed third on the same list. The proximity fuse was, in the assessment of Admiral Lewis Strauss and others who saw the program from the inside, one of the small handful of technical developments without which Allied victory in the form it took would not have been possible. To understand why the Germans, who had a head start, never built one, and why the Americans, who had no infrastructure for the work in 1940, eventually built more than 22 million of them, you have to go back to a single sketch on a piece of paper in southern England in the early summer of 1940. The man who drew that sketch was a New Zealand-born physicist named William Allen Stewart Butemont. He worked at the Air Defence Experimental Establishment at Christchurch in Dorset, on the south coast of England, and he had been thinking, since the start of the Battle of Britain, about a problem that the British Army was failing in real time to solve. Anti-aircraft guns were almost not killing aircraft. The numbers from the summer of 1940 depended on the source you trusted, but they were uniformly bad. Some Royal Artillery estimates required somewhere between 1,200 and 20,000 rounds of 3.7-inch high-explosive ammunition to bring down a single Luftwaffe bomber. Wartime official figures landed in the middle of that range. The cause was the fuse. There were two kinds of fuse in service. The contact fuse exploded when the shell physically struck a solid object. Against an aircraft, it was nearly useless. Aircraft are mostly empty space wrapped in thin metal, and a contact-fused shell tended to punch through a wing without detonating. The time fuse, set by hand before the round was loaded, told the shell to explode after a specified number of seconds. It worked in theory. In practice, it required the gunner to predict where the aircraft would be at the moment of detonation, encode that prediction in a clockwork mechanism, and then trust that the aircraft would not change altitude, course, or speed in the seconds the shell was in flight. The aircraft did all three of those things constantly. Time fuses produced beautiful explosions in places where the aircraft were not. Butemont, working with two colleagues named Edward Samuel Shire and Amherst Thompson, formally proposed an alternative in May of 1940. The idea had first occurred to him in October of the previous year. Their proposal was that the shell carry a tiny radio inside it, transmit a continuous wave outward as it flew, and listen for the reflection from a target. As the target approached, the Doppler shift in the returning frequency would change. When the change reached a certain threshold, the shell would detonate on its own. There would be no clockwork. The shell, in effect, would decide for itself when to fire. The principle was simple. The execution was not. The British tried for most of 1940. They built bench prototypes that worked sitting on a wooden table in a Surrey laboratory. The moment the same circuits were placed inside any kind of fast-moving projectile, they failed. Glass valves shattered, solder joints sheared, wire leads broke. By the autumn, Britain's wartime science establishment had reached a quiet conclusion. The country was too poor, too embattled, and too short of skilled labour to solve the problem alone. They needed a partner with deeper pockets and bigger factories. In September of 1940, a delegation led by the British scientist Sir Henry Tizard sailed for the United States. They carried with them a black metal trunk that contained, among other things, the cavity magnetron that would make microwave radar possible, the early jet engine designs of Frank Whittle, materials on British atomic research, and a thin sheaf of documents on the radio proximity fuse. The Tizard mission has been called, with some fairness, the most valuable cargo ever to cross the Atlantic in a single shipment. The Americans understood within days what they had been given. The men they handed the proximity fuse documents to were a small group at the Carnegie Institution of Washington's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, working under Fuze. Fuze himself is one of the most consequential American scientists of the 20th century, and one of the least remembered by the general public. He was born in Canton, South Dakota, on the 27th of June, 1901. All four of his grandparents were Norwegian immigrants. His father, Anthony G. Tuve, was president of Augustana College, the small Norwegian Lutheran institution in Canton. His mother, Ida Marie Larsen Tuve, was a music teacher at the same college. Merle Tuve grew up in a house next door to the Lawrence family. The Lawrence boy, Ernest Orlando, would later invent the cyclotron and win the Nobel Prize in physics. The two boys built homemade radio sets together when they were 13 years old. Tuve studied physics at the University of Minnesota and earned his doctorate at Johns Hopkins in 1927. By the late 1930s, he was one of the leading American experimental physicists, a pioneer in the use of pulsed radio waves to measure the height of the ionosphere. The technique he and Gregory Bright developed in 1925 was, in essence, the conceptual predecessor of radar. When Vannevar Bush organized the National Defense Research Committee in the summer of 1940, he turned to Tuve to lead the proximity fuse project. The administrative section was given a cover name. It was called Section T. The letter was for Tuve. By the early months of 1942, the project had grown beyond anything the Carnegie Institution could host comfortably. Carnegie's trustees were uncomfortable presiding over classified weapons work, and the project's space and personnel needs had outpaced what the Broad Branch Road wing could supply. So on the 10th of March 1942, the Johns Hopkins University formally established a new entity called the Applied Physics Laboratory to take it over. The original APL building was a former Chevrolet dealership and used car garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, on Georgia Avenue. The men who worked there sometimes joked that the country's most secret weapons research was being conducted in a building that still smelled faintly of motor oil. What the Section T team did at the Applied Physics Laboratory between 1942 and the end of the war is the part of the story that does not get told often enough, because it does not lend itself to a single dramatic moment. It was a grinding, methodical, exhausting industrial research program of a kind no army or navy on Earth had previously attempted on this scale. James Van Allen, who joined Fuze's group at Carnegie in late 1941 and transferred with the project to APL in the spring of 1942, would later become one of the most celebrated American scientists of the 20th century. The radiation belts that surround the Earth carry his name. He left a memoir of the proximity fuse years that survives in the archives of Johns Hopkins. The memoir describes, among other things, the centrifuges Van Allen and his colleagues built to test miniature vacuum tubes. The centrifuges were rigs that spun a tube at thousands of revolutions per minute and dropped it through a measured distance to simulate the linear acceleration of being fired from a gun. Van Allen and his team built dozens of versions of these rigs and used them to test every shape of vacuum tube envelope, every internal mounting, every potting compound, every filament support, every cathode metal they could think of. The first prototypes shattered every time. The second batch shattered most of the time. By the middle of 1941, they had a tube that could survive about half the test firings. By the end of that year, they had a tube that survived 70% of the time. By the spring of 1942, they had a tube that survived consistently. Van Allen wrote later that the floor of the test laboratory was thick with broken glass for most of 1941. They mopped it up at the end of every shift and started over the next morning. The German equivalent program was doing none of this. The German proximity fuse effort, such as it was scattered across at least 7 separate firms, working on more than 30 different fuse designs in parallel. There was an electrostatic fuse being developed at Rheinmetall-Borsig that, in initial tests, had shown some genuine promise. It was suspended in 1940 when senior leadership directed German industry to wind down any research project that could not produce a fielded weapon within roughly 6 months. The intention was to free resources for the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. The effect was to gut almost every long-horizon technology program Germany had. The Rheinmetall electrostatic fuse was suspended. The early German cavity magnetron program was suspended. Several jet engine projects were starved of resources. None of these decisions could be reversed quickly. By the time the war turned and the Germans tried to restart some of the suspended programs in 1944, it was too late. Allied bombing had degraded the precision manufacturing base they would have needed. There was an acoustic fuse called Kranich, German for crane, that detected aircraft engines by frequency and tried to detonate at the peak of the sound. It worked in laboratory conditions and failed in flight because the noise of a projectile cutting through the air drowned out the engine sound it was supposed to listen for. There was a photoelectric fuse named Pistole that tried to detect the shadow of an aircraft passing over the shell. There were infrared concepts, capacitive concepts, and other acoustic concepts with names like Mazy and Stimmgabel and Trichter. None of them ever entered mass production. None of them ever shot down a single aircraft. The men running these projects were not unimpressive. The acoustic engineers at the Graf Zeppelin Institute were among the best in the world at their specialty. The electrostatic team at Rheinmetall genuinely understood the physics of capacitive sensing. What they did not have was a single person in the role Fuze was playing in Washington. They did not have one administrative authority who could stand in a room and assign physicists, electrical engineers, ordnance experts, and mass production specialists to the same problem, in the same building, under the same deadline. The German military research system had been deliberately structured to prevent any one bureaucratic faction from accumulating too much power. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the SS all ran their own competing research programs, often duplicating each other's work, often classified at levels that prevented other German engineers from knowing the work existed. There were academic specialists in Germany in 1943 who genuinely did not know that other German scientists were working on the same fuse problem they were, because the security compartmentalization made the knowledge unavailable. By contrast, Fuze's team at APL had grown by 1944 to a workforce of roughly 30,000 people across the laboratory itself, the production contractors, and the affiliated supply chain. Almost all of them knew, at least in general terms, what they were building and why. By the spring of 1942, the Section T team had a working tube. By midsummer, they had a working circuit. By August of that year, they were ready to put a fuse into an actual shell and fire it at an actual target. The test was conducted on the 12th of August 1942 off the cruiser USS Cleveland, then on her shakedown cruise in Chesapeake Bay. The targets were 3 remotely controlled drone aircraft. The 5-inch guns on the Cleveland fired 4 bursts of proximity fused shells over the course of the first morning. All 3 drones were shot down. The test had been scheduled to last 2 days. After watching the 3rd drone tumble into the bay, the Navy ordered the firing to stop. They had seen enough. Mass production began almost immediately. 5 companies were brought in to assemble the fuses. They were the Crossley Corporation in Cincinnati, the Radio Corporation of America, the Eastman Kodak Company, General Electric, and McQuay Norris. Within months, Sylvania Electric Products was added for the manufacture of the miniature vacuum tubes themselves. Eventually, more than 100 firms in total, including unlikely contributors like the Wurlitzer Organ Company in North Tonawanda, New York, were involved in some part of the production. By the end of the war, just over 22 million fuses would have been manufactured. The unit cost would fall from $732 in 1942 to $18 in 1945. The total program cost would exceed $1 billion in the money of the time, making it the second most expensive military research and development effort of the entire war, surpassed only by the atomic bomb. Almost no one outside the program knew it existed. The first combat shipment of 5,000 fuses was personally escorted to the Pacific by a naval ordnance officer named William Sterling Parsons, a square-shouldered Navy captain who had attached himself to Section T at Fuze's request. Parsons was unusual among American officers in his ease with both scientists and admirals, and he would later, in August of 1945, be the man who armed the little boy bomb aboard the Enola Gay over the Pacific. In late 1942, he flew with the first batch of fuses to New Caledonia and reported to Admiral William Halsey at his South Pacific Command. Halsey, after consulting his staff, decided that the cruiser USS Helena and the carriers USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga were the ships most likely to come under air attack in the immediate future. Parsons divided the shells among the 3 vessels. He stayed aboard Helena himself. On the morning of the 5th of January 1943, Helena was returning to her formation after participating in a shore bombardment of the Japanese-held airfield at Munda on New Georgia. She was sailing south of Guadalcanal in the late morning when a flight of Japanese dive bombers, Aichi D-3, as of the type the Allies code-named Val, came in low across the formation. The attack was so sudden that the bombers had completed their runs before the fleet's air search radar had registered them properly. As the surviving Vals pulled up and began to climb away, an officer on Helena nicknamed Red Cochrane, who commanded the aft 5-inch battery, ordered his guns to fire on the departing aircraft. He had with him in the magazine a mixed load of conventional anti-aircraft shells with mechanical time fuses and a smaller number of the new shells that the gun crews had been told only were experimental, secret, and not to be discussed. Cochrane gave the order to fire. According to the most thorough surviving account, his second salvo of 3 included VT fused rounds. One of the shells detonated in the air close to a climbing Val. The aircraft was hit by the burst, caught fire, and fell into the sea. Parsons, who was on the bridge of the Helena watching through binoculars, said almost nothing. He went below to write his report. What he wrote in that report has been preserved in the files of the Bureau of Ordnance. It is short and restrained. He noted the date, the time, the conditions, the rounds expended, the aircraft destroyed. He concluded with the observation that the value of the new fuse cannot be too highly stressed. Neither Parsons nor anyone else knew yet what they had witnessed. By the end of 1943, Only about a quarter of the anti-aircraft ammunition fired by United States Navy ships in the Pacific would be fitted with proximity fuses, and yet that quarter would account for slightly more than half of all Japanese aircraft brought down by naval gunfire. Across the war, Allied technical assessments concluded that proximity-fused ammunition was 3 to 4 times more effective per round than time-fused ammunition, despite a dud rate that ran at roughly 30%. The Helena herself would not survive long enough to see the full transformation she had helped begin. On the night of the 5th and 6th of July 1943, 6 months after that morning off Guadalcanal, she was struck by Japanese torpedoes during the Battle of Kula Gulf and sank. Most of her crew were rescued. Some of the men who had been at her 5-inch guns the previous January went on to other ships and other engagements. Between the Helena's combat debut and the closing months of the war, the proximity fuse went through 2 distinct operational phases that together accounted for most of its impact on the conflict. The first was the Pacific Naval Anti-Aircraft mission for which it had originally been designed. By the late summer of 1944, almost every 5-inch and 90mm anti-aircraft shell in the United States Navy's Pacific stockpile was fitted with a proximity fuse. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of that year, sometimes called the Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw American carrier groups inflict crushing losses on Japanese naval aviation, in part because the proximity fuse made every 5-inch burst statistically equivalent to a much larger weapon. Allied technical analyses concluded after the war that proximity-fused 5-inch shells achieved kill rates roughly 3 to 4 times those of time-fused shells over the same period. In the closing year of the war, when Japanese tactics shifted to deliberate kamikaze attack runs at low altitude, the fuse proved even more critical. Veteran admirals later credited it as one of the few defensive measures that consistently worked against an aircraft being deliberately flown into a ship. Vice Admiral Arleigh Burke, who served as Chief of Staff to Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanding the Fast Carrier Task Forces, said in an interview at the Applied Physics Laboratory in 1978 that the fuses had brought down enemy aircraft by the dozens, and that without them American ship losses and casualties in the last half of the war would have been enormously larger. The second operational phase was the European Air Defence Mission, which came in 2 parts. In June of 1944, a week after the Allied landings in Normandy, the Germans began launching the V-1 cruise missile against London. The V-1 was a small jet-powered pilotless aircraft flying low and fast, exactly the kind of target that conventional anti-aircraft artillery had been built specifically not to handle. Tens of thousands of British civilians were killed or wounded by V-1 strikes over the summer of 1944. The United States authorized the use of proximity fuses on the British coastal anti-aircraft belt on the 12th of June. The combination of the proximity fuse, the SCR, 584 radar, and the M9 fire control computer transformed the kill rate of the British coastal guns over a matter of weeks. In the first week, the gun belt was shooting down roughly 17% of approaching V-1S. By the end of August, the figure had risen to about 74%, and on the final day of intensive launches, the British radar detected 104 V-1S approaching the coast, and the gun belt destroyed 68 of them, with only 4 reaching London. After the Germans were pushed beyond V-1 range of southeastern England in the autumn, they retargeted the weapon at the recently captured Belgian port of Antwerp, which was vital to Allied resupply on the European continent. APL physicists redesigned the fuse for the lower altitudes the Antwerp V-1S were flying. The modified fuses were rushed into production at the Crossley factory in Cincinnati and flown across the Atlantic in a special detail of Lancaster bombers, authorized personally by Winston Churchill. A single anti-aircraft battalion in Antwerp accounted for 48 of the first 75 V-1S it engaged. By the end of the war, anti-aircraft units defending Antwerp had destroyed more than 2,000 V-1S, and the port had remained operational throughout the German campaign against it. If you have made it this far in this story, the like button helps work like this reach the people who care about getting the engineering history right. The men and women who built the fuse, most of them, never received public credit for it because the project remained classified for years after the war. Most are gone now. The story is one of the few things still left of them. The records of the Sylvania Electric Products plant in Emporium, Pennsylvania, give some sense of what the rest of the program looked like behind the scenes. Sylvania had been chosen to manufacture the miniature vacuum tubes themselves because of the company's existing experience with hearing aid valves and its established quality control protocols. The Emporium facility ran on 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. The workforce was almost entirely women, in some cases trained over only a few weeks to assemble components smaller than a grain of rice with their bare hands, working under high magnification. They were paid wages that were modest by the standards of skilled industrial labor. They were not allowed to discuss the work with their husbands or fathers, many of whom were overseas. The vast majority of the women did not know what the tubes they were building were ultimately used for. Most of them believed they were making radio components, which in a literal sense was true. What is striking about Sylvania's wartime production records, and the records of the corresponding tube and fuse plants at Crosley in Cincinnati, RCA in Camden, General Electric in Schenectady, and Eastman Kodak in Rochester, is the quality data. The defect rates on the miniature vacuum tubes coming off those lines were better than any consumer electronics defect rate of the time. In some quarters, they were better than what the same plants would achieve in peacetime, making radios for civilian living rooms. The reason had little to do with management technique. It had to do with the social pressure to produce flawless output in a country whose sons, brothers, and husbands were being shot at on the other side of the world. Lewis M. Clement, who served as vice president in charge of engineering at the Crosley Corporation during the war, said in later interviews that he had never in his career seen production discipline of the kind he saw in the wartime fuse plants. The women working under him caught defects he himself would have missed. The fuse itself was an extraordinary object. Inside the nose of an artillery shell, in a space about the size of a small flashbulb, sat a complete radio transmitter and receiver, a power supply, a detonating mechanism, and a series of safety interlocks. The total assembly contained roughly 130 separate components. 5 of them were the miniaturized glass vacuum tubes that Van Allen and his team had spent years learning to make survivable. The power source was a chemical battery whose electrolyte was held in a tiny glass ampule that shattered on firing, releasing the acid and activating the battery, but only after the shell had cleared the gun barrel and traveled a short distance through the air. This sequence ensured that no fuse could possibly detonate inside the gun. The transmitter put out a continuous radio wave at roughly 200 MHz. The receiver listened for the Doppler-shifted return. When the return reached a certain amplitude, the circuit closed and fired the detonator. The whole system had to function end-to-end within seconds of the shell leaving the barrel, in a unit that had been mass-produced rather than handcrafted, in temperatures that ranged from Pacific Ocean humidity to Ardennes alpine cold. It worked. Not always. Roughly 3 in 10 fuses were duds, but 7 in 10 of them, on average, did what they were supposed to do. That number should not have been physically achievable with the materials and manufacturing techniques available at the start of the war. It was achieved anyway, by the slow accumulation of small engineering victories over a period of about 28 months from the Tizard mission of September 1940 to the Helena's combat debut in January 1943. The question worth pausing on, and the question Tuve himself returned to in interviews after the war, is why the Germans never built one. The answer is in 3 pieces, and each piece tells you something about how war actually works that the popular memory of the conflict tends to gloss over. The first piece is the leadership decision in the summer and autumn of 1940 to terminate German research programs that could not deliver a fielded weapon within a short window. The intent was to free resources for what the leadership expected to be a fast war. The effect was to gut Germany's long-horizon technology pipeline at exactly the moment when the kinds of slow, methodical, multi-year programs that would later prove decisive were being launched in Britain and the United States. The Rheinmetall electrostatic proximity fuse was one casualty. The early German cavity magnetron program was another. By the time the war ran longer than expected and the suspensions were reversed, Allied bombing had so degraded the German precision manufacturing base that the programs could not have hit volume production even if the science had been completed. The second piece is the structure of German wartime research itself. The German military did not have a Vannevar Bush or a Merle Tuve. It did not have a single civilian-led organization with the authority to coordinate physicists, engineers, industrial managers, and procurement officials across the entire economy. The Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and the SS each ran their own research programs, often in competition with each other, often duplicating effort, with parallel bureaucracies adding more layers on top. The proximity Fuze projects ended up scattered across the Graf Zeppelin Institute, the Orlik Institute of Danzig, Blaupunkt, Rheinmetall, the Electro-Acoustic Institute, and others, with no central authority. None were sharing data with the others. The third piece is the workforce. By 1944, Germany was running its precision electronics industry on a combination of forced labor and increasingly desperate shifts of women, teenagers, and elderly workers in facilities being bombed regularly. The kind of patient, exact, repetitive assembly work that miniature vacuum tubes required is not work that exhausted, malnourished people working under threat can do at the precision required. Sylvania's plant in Emporium produced its tubes at quality rates that exceeded peacetime consumer output. The German equivalent of Sylvania did not exist by 1944 because the buildings that would have housed it had been bombed and the workers who would have staffed it had either been drafted or were too hungry to perform skilled assembly. So when German engineers studying the physics of a working radio fuse had concluded in 1940 that no such device could be built reliably with the components available, they were not lying or being defeatist. From inside their own circumstances, the assessment was correct. They could not have built it. What they did not see, because no German engineer had access to the inside of the applied physics laboratory, was that the Americans were not solving the impossibility through a new theoretical insight. The physics was the same physics the Germans understood. The Americans were solving it through coordinated, well-funded, well-staffed, methodical industrial science of a kind their own system had been actively designed to make impossible. On the 16th of December 1944, the proximity fuse made its second public appearance, in a way that almost no one in Germany understood at the time was even happening. The Battle of the Bulge began that morning in heavy fog and freezing rain. German divisions broke through the thinly held Ardennes sector and began driving west toward the Meuse River. American artillery units in the path of the assault had, in their stockpiles, a category of shell they had until very recently been forbidden to use. The proximity fuse, code-named POSIT for use over land, had been authorized in the summer for service against the V-1 flying bomb over the English Channel and around Antwerp, but the combined chiefs of staff had refused permission for its use over the European continent for fear that an unexploded round might land in German territory and be reverse-engineered. That permission had been granted on the 25th of October 1944, after the V-1 threat to Antwerp made the secrecy concerns moot. By the morning of the 16th of December, the fuses were in the European artillery dumps. Not all the gunners yet knew how to use them. A colonel named George Axelson, commanding the United States Army's 406th Artillery Group, heard at first light that the 38th Cavalry Squadron at Monschau was in danger of being overrun and had called for fire support. He had POSIT shells in his magazines. Eisenhower had not yet given formal theatre-wide permission for their ground use on the European continent. Axelson made the decision on his own. He ordered POSIT fired. The shells began to detonate 20 to 30 feet above the heads of the advancing infantry, spreading shrapnel over a much larger area than a conventional time fuse burst. 3 days later, on the 19th of December, Eisenhower formally requested clearance to use POSIT throughout the theatre. 2 days after that, all restrictions were removed. By the end of the offensive, approximately 200,000 POSIT shells had been fired in the Ardennes. The civilian and military casualty figures of the Battle of the Bulge were staggering on both sides. American forces suffered roughly 19,000 killed and tens of thousands more wounded. German losses were higher still. Belgian and Luxembourgish civilians caught in the fighting were among the worst affected. The proximity fuse did not change the moral arithmetic of the battle. What it changed was the technical arithmetic. General George Patton, whose Third Army turned 90 degrees north and drove to the relief of the besieged town of Bastogne in the last week of December, wrote a letter to the United States Army's Chief of Ordnance, Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr. in early January of 1945, describing what he had seen. The letter has been reproduced in multiple official histories and is part of the Patton Papers in the Library of Congress. In it, Patton used the phrase "the funny fuse," which had become the slang term among gun crews. He wrote that he had caught a German unit attempting to cross the Sauer River with a battalion concentration of the funny fuse. The official count of enemy dead from that one engagement, as Patton recorded it, was over 700. Patton thought, he wrote, that when all armies eventually had this kind of shell, the entire concept of land warfare would have to be rethought. He was glad, he wrote, that the Americans had thought of it first. Surviving Allied intelligence records from the closing months of the war include interrogation summaries of German prisoners taken during the Bulge and the subsequent retreat eastward. The descriptions of the proximity fuse coming from those summaries were uniformly bleak. One captured German soldier, quoted in post-war Bureau of Ordnance documents, described the new American shells as quick, powerful bursts for which there was simply no defense. Multiple prisoners reported that veteran troops had begun refusing to leave their foxholes during American artillery barrages because the new shells, unlike anything they had encountered earlier in the war, would detonate above them whether or not the men firing the guns could see exactly where they were. The German engineers who were eventually shown captured posite shells in the technical interrogations conducted by Allied intelligence teams in 1945 and 1946 described the design as ingenious and the miniaturization as remarkable. They did not describe the project as impossible, because the hardware they were holding had already disproved the impossibility. What the German technical assessments kept returning to, quietly, in the surviving documents, was the same observation. The technology in the fuse itself was not extraordinary. The vacuum tubes were better than anything in the German hearing aid industry, but they were not categorically beyond what German firms could in principle have built. The circuit was simple. The radio frequency physics were textbook. Why, the German engineers in the post-war interrogations kept asking themselves, had they not built it? Fuze, in interviews he gave after the war once the program had been declassified, offered something close to an answer. In one widely cited interview held in the archives of the Applied Physics Laboratory, he made the observation that the success of the proximity fuse had not depended on a basic technical idea that someone had to discover. All of the ideas, he said, were simple and well known everywhere. What had mattered, he went on, was getting people to act on the ideas rather than spend 6 months arguing about them, and getting an engineered, working, mass-producible object into the hands of a sailor on a ship in the Pacific in less time than the enemy could organize a committee meeting to decide whether the same idea was worth pursuing. That second observation has not aged the way most wartime engineering remarks age. It has, if anything, gotten sharper. The proximity fuse worked because of a country that, for a few extraordinary years, organized itself with enough patience and enough scale and enough trust between scientists and industrialists and Navy officers and women in Pennsylvania factories to put one small piece of hardware, the size of a flashbulb, into the nose of 22 million artillery shells. The Germans were correct about the difficulty. They were wrong about the country that turned out to be capable of facing it. If you served in the Pacific or in Europe in those years, in any branch, in any rank, on any ship, in any battery, on any factory floor, or if your father, grandfather, mother, or grandmother did, I would value reading about it in the comments. The men and women who built the fuse are mostly gone. The men who fired it are nearly gone. The records survive in scattered archives and family attics and faded letters. Adding a comment with what your relative actually did, where they were stationed, what they remembered, is in its small way an act of historical preservation. These stories slip out of public memory faster than most people realize. Fuze died on the 20th of May 1982 in Bethesda, Maryland. His obituaries identified him primarily as a pioneer of radio astronomy and ionospheric research. Most of them mentioned the proximity fuse in a single line. James Van Allen lived another 24 years, dying in 2006 at the age of 91, having outlived nearly all of his Section T colleagues. William Sterling Parsons died of a heart attack in December of 1953 at the age of 52, his career still mostly classified. Louis Clement of Crosley returned to civilian electronics after the war and gave occasional interviews about the production effort. The thousands of women who had built the tubes in Emporium and Cincinnati and Schenectady and Bridgeport went home when the war ended. Some of them returned to lives as wives and mothers, and were never told what they had been making. Some of them were eventually told, decades later, when the program was declassified, and were quietly proud and rarely brought it up. The principle that Butemont first sketched on a piece of paper in southern England in 1940 became the basis for almost every guided munition built in the 80 years that followed. In modified form, it sits inside every modern surface-to-air missile, every laser-guided artillery round, every smart munition any modern military deploys. The men and women who built the original were laying the groundwork for an entire branch of military technology that did not yet exist when they started. What I keep noticing when I read the surviving records is the smallness of the thing itself. A proximity fuse of the wartime period was about 3 inches long. It weighed roughly 1.5 pounds. It contained, in a space no bigger than a child's fist, an answer to a problem that the best engineers in Europe had concluded was unsolvable. It was not solved by a single flash of insight. It was solved by people sitting at workbenches in Maryland and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana, soldering components together for 10 hours at a stretch, and going home and not telling anyone what they had done. Some of them did this for 4 years. None of them ever fired one of the shells they had built. Most of them never met a single one of the people whose lives the work had ultimately changed. That, in the end, is the part the German engineers could not have seen looking at a captured shell from the outside. They were inspecting a piece of hardware. The hardware was, in a sense, the easy part. The hard part was a country that had agreed, for a few unusual years, to put its industrial intelligence and its scientific patience, and its women in factory towns, and its plain-spoken physicists from the prairie, all behind a single small object, and to trust that the object would be enough. It was. The fuse worked. The war ended. Most of the people who built it went home and did not speak of it again. If this kind of investigation, the kind that goes into the engineering and the workshops and the names that the popular histories leave out, is what you would like more of, the subscribe button helps. There are other stories like this one. Not all of them are about battles. Some of them are about little glass tubes on workbenches and the people who, year after year, refused to stop trying to make them work.